One night, after they had taken some chocolate bars from Uncle Ben's shop, Queeneth couldn't eat her dinner. She stared at the rice and stew their mother had left in the fridge, but her stomach felt uneasy. "What if Uncle Ben finds out?" she whispered to Daniel as they sat in their room. "What if he tells Daddy?" "He won't," Daniel replied, but his voice didn't sound confident. "Shopkeepers don't count every single sweet they have." Even as he said it, they both knew this couldn't continue. Sooner or later, something was bound to happen. And it did. The next week, something scary happened. Queeneth was talking to Uncle Ben about some pencils when the shop door opened. It was Mama Blessing from downstairs. At that moment, Daniel had just slipped 2 chocolate bars into his pocket. "Ah, Johnson's children," Mama Blessing said loudly. "What are you buying today?" Daniel froze. His heart pounded, and the chocolates in his pocket felt like they weighed a ton. Uncle Ben turned to look at them, waiting for an answer. We're just looking," Queeneth blurted out. Her voice sounded high-pitched and nervous. They hurried out of the shop, almost running. Mama Blessing gave them a strange look as they left. That night, Daniel and Queeneth overheard Uncle Ben talking to their neighbor about missing things from his shop. "I don't get it," he said. "Things keep going missing, but I can't figure out." But they stopped when they noticed Mrs. Gloria's serious expression. The teacher looked at Queeneth with concern. She remembered how Queen be upset. But they felt lighter now, as if a huge weight had been lifted off their shoulders. They weren't carrying the secret alone anymore, and they knew that with Mrs. Gloria's help, they could face whatever came next. The sun was setting when Mrs. Gloria walked to the Johnson house. She stopped at the gate and checked her phone. It was 7:30 p.m. She knew this visit could change everything for the family. Just then, Mr. Johnson's car turned onto the street, followed closely by Mrs. Johnson's car. She had arrived at the perfect time. Inside, Mrs. Johnson was taking off her head tea when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to see her children's teacher, Mrs. Gloria, standing there. Her heart skipped. "Good evening, Ma. Is everything okay with my children?" she asked nervously. They all sat in the living room. Mr. Johnson loosened his tie and dropped his laptop bag, while Mrs. Johnson twisted the edge of her wrapper, looking worried. The ceiling fan clicked loudly as it spun, and the room felt strangely empty. No toys, no school books, nothing that showed children lived there. "I need to tell you something about Daniel and Queeneth," said Mrs. Gloria. The parents leaned forward, anxious to hear. In the kitchen, Daniel and Queeneth pressed their ears against the door, listening. Queeneth clung to her brother's arm, her palms sweating. Slowly, Mrs. Gloria explained everything. The stealing, how it started small but had become a habit, and how Queeneth had been crying in class from guilt. Mr. Johnson jumped up, his voice booming. "It's not possible. My children are not thieves," his loud words echoed in the room. "We raised them better than this. We go to church every Sunday. I pay for their expensive school. What else do they need?" He began pacing the floor, his shoes tapping loudly. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson sat frozen, shaking her head in disbelief. When Mr. Johnson finally stopped shouting, Mrs. Gloria said gently, "Sir, children need more than money and Sunday church. They need their parents." At that moment, the kitchen door creaked open. Daniel and Queeneth walked in, their faces pale. Queeneth's cheeks were wet with tears, and Daniel stared at the floor, unable to look up. "Is it true?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Have you been stealing from Uncle Ben's shop?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, Mama," he said. Then, bravely, he added, "But it's my fault. I made Queeneth help me. Don't punish her." Mr. Johnson's face turned dark. "Do you know what people will say?" he asked angrily. "That Johnson's children are thieves. Is this why I work so hard? To raise criminals?" Hearing this, Queeneth ran to her mother and buried her face in her lap, crying hard. Without thinking, Mrs. Johnson stroked her daughter's hair. For the first time in years, she realized how much she had been missing. "Your children are asking for help," said Mrs. Gloria. "Not with words, but with their actions. Yes, they made a mistake, but ask yourselves why they felt they had to do this." The room went silent. Mr. Johnson finally sat down and looked at his children. Daniel, trying to be brave, but clearly scared. And Queeneth, clinging to her mother like she was afraid she'd disappear. "When was the last time you ate dinner together?" asked Mrs. Gloria. "When was the last time you helped with homework or asked about their day?" Nobody could answer. They all knew the truth. It had been too long. Daniel broke the silence. "Other kids go home to hot food and parents who ask about their day," he said, his voice shaking. "We go home to an empty house and leftover food." Those words hit Mrs. Johnson like a slap. She remembered how her own mother always had food ready after school. When had she stopped doing that for her own children? Mr. Johnson slumped in his chair. "I thought giving you everything we didn't have was enough," he said quietly. "What do we do now?" asked Mrs. Johnson, holding Queeneth tightly. "You start over," said Mrs. Gloria. "Not as a bank manager or a shop owner, but as parents." As Mrs. Gloria left, she heard the family starting to talk. Really talk. It seemed like the first time they had done this in years. She thought to herself, sometimes a big problem can bring a family closer. After she left, the living room felt quiet, but different. Mr. Johnson sat in his chair, no longer angry. Now he looked worried and ashamed. "Tell me everything," he said to the children. His voice wasn't loud anymore. It sounded tired. "I need to know how this started." Daniel took a deep breath. He decided to tell the truth. "Every day, we're alone in this house," he said. His voice was shaky at first, but got stronger. "When Mama Blessing's kids come home, they smell rice cooking. Their mother asks them about school and their games." He looked straight at his father. "When Olamide is sad, his dad takes him for ice cream and talks to him. But for us, we only see your backs in the morning, and you're too tired to talk at night." Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were quiet. Daniel's words hurt, but they knew he was right. Mrs. Johnson hugged Queeneth tightly. She looked at her daughter and realized how small she still was. Just an 8-year-old girl who needed her mom. "I thought I was being a good mother by working hard," Mrs. Johnson said softly. "By giving you good clothes and a good school." Her voice cracked. "I didn't realize I was leaving you all alone." Mr. Johnson stood up and walked over to Daniel. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm very disappointed about the stealing," he said firmly. "What you did was wrong, and you know it." Daniel nodded and stared at the floor. "But," Mr. Johnson continued, "your mother and I made mistakes too. We left you alone when you needed us. That stops now." For the first time that evening, Daniel and Queeneth felt hopeful. Their parents weren't just upset about the stealing. They were finally listening to them. Mrs. Johnson wiped her tears and stood up. "Let's start with dinner," she said. "When was the last time we ate together?" Nobody could remember. "Then that's where we'll begin," she said. "I'll warm up the soup in the fridge, and we'll eat as a family. Tomorrow, we'll work on fixing the rest." That night, they sat around the table together, sharing soup and eBay. They still had to make things right with Uncle Ben. There would still be consequences for what had happened. But as they talked and ate, they started to feel like a real family again. The next morning was not like the usual busy mornings in the Johnson house. Instead of rushing off to work, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson got Daniel and Queeneth ready for an important visit. They were heading to Uncle Ben's shop. Daniel's legs felt shaky as they walked down the street. Each step made his heart race faster. Queeneth clung to her mother's hand, her face tight with worry, as if she might burst into tears at any moment. When they got to Uncle Ben's shop, he was arranging boxes of biscuits on the shelves. He turned around when he heard footsteps and looked surprised. He wasn't used to seeing well-dressed people like Mr. and Mrs. Johnson in his small shop. "Good morning, Uncle Ben," Mr. Johnson said politely but seriously. "We need to talk to you about something important." Uncle Ben looked confused, but pointed to some plastic chairs outside. "Please, sit down," he said, not knowing what to expect. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat and put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "My children have something to tell you." Daniel stepped forward, his legs shaking. He remembered what his father had said that morning. Being brave means doing the right thing, even if you're scared. "Uncle Ben," Daniel started in a quiet voice. He had to speak louder. "Uncle Ben, I've been stealing from your shop. Sweets, biscuits, chocolates. I took them without paying." He felt tears in his eyes, but kept going. "I made my sister help by distracting you. We're very sorry." The shop became so quiet, they could hear cars passing on the road. Uncle Ben's face changed from surprise to angry, and then to something sad. Mrs. Johnson stepped in. "We want to make things right," she said, taking out her purse. "We will pay for everything they took." But Uncle Ben held up his hand. He looked at Daniel and Queeneth, thinking about how polite they had always seemed. He also remembered seeing them walk home alone every day, carrying their school bags. "How long has this been going on?" he asked Daniel. 3 weeks, Daniel said honestly. "Almost every other day." Uncle Ben thought for a moment. Then he surprised everyone. "Keep your money," he told Mrs. Johnson. "I have a better idea." He turned to Daniel. "Instead of paying me back with money, you'll work in my shop every Saturday for the next month." Mr. Johnson frowned. "Work? But he's just a child." Not hard work, Uncle Ben explained. He'll help arrange items, count stock, and give change to customers. He'll learn the value of the things he took and what it means to earn honestly. Daniel looked up in surprise. He had expected a punishment, or even for the police to be called, but this was different. And one more thing, Uncle Ben said, smiling a little. At the end of each Saturday, you can choose one sweet or chocolate that you earn honestly. For the first time that morning, Daniel felt something besides fear and shame. Was this really happening? He looked at his parents. Mr. Johnson nodded. I think this is a good idea. He turned to his son. What do you say, Daniel? Yes, sir, Daniel said quickly. I'll work hard. I promise. Queeneth, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. Can I help too? Uncle Ben laughed. You want to work too, even though you didn't want to steal? Queeneth nodded. I should have tried harder to stop my brother. And I think it might be fun to learn how to run a shop. Uncle Ben smiled. Okay, both of you can help, but only for a few hours each Saturday. The rest of the day should be for your family. Mrs. Johnson wiped a tear from her eye. Instead of anger, they had found kindness and a chance to learn. As they walked home, Mr. Johnson checked his watch. It was only 9 a.m. Usually, he would be stuck in traffic heading to work. But today was different. Today was the start of something new. "2 days a week," he said firmly. "My children need me." His boss looked surprised. "That's not common here, Johnson. Nobody does that." "Then I'll be the first," Mr. Johnson replied. He thought about all the times Daniel had tried to talk to him about school, and he had brushed him off, saying, "Not now, I'm tired." He didn't want to keep making that mistake. To Mr. Johnson's surprise, his boss agreed. "Maybe this will set a new example," he said. "Family comes first, right?" The biggest change happened in their house. The spare room, which had been full of old boxes and dusty things, was cleared out. Mr. Johnson and the children spent a whole Saturday cleaning it up. They painted the walls bright yellow, and some of the paint even got on their clothes. "What will this room be for?" Queeneth asked, as she wiped yellow paint off her nose. "It will be our study room," her father said with a smile. "A place where we can spend time together in the evenings." They bought a big table that could fit all 4 of them. Mrs. Johnson added comfy chairs and bright lights. On one wall, they put up a board where Queeneth and Daniel could pin their drawings and good test scores. Every evening after school, something special happened in the yellow room. Daniel and Queeneth worked on their homework while their parents stayed close by. Sometimes Mrs. Johnson did her shop's paperwork, and other times Mr. Johnson worked on his laptop for the bank. But the important thing was, they were there, ready to help. "Mama," Queeneth would ask, I don't get this math problem." Instead of saying she was too busy, Mrs. Johnson would slide her chair closer to help. Sometimes she didn't know the new methods either, but they would figure it out together, laughing when they made mistakes. Daniel's Saturdays at Uncle Ben's shop turned out to be more fun than he expected. It wasn't just about arranging items on shelves or counting money. Uncle Ben was also teaching him important lessons about life. "Look at this customer," Uncle Ben said one day, pointing to an old woman counting her coins carefully. "She saves her money all week, just to buy bread for her grandchildren. That's why it's important to always be honest in business. What we do can really help or hurt people." One Saturday, while organizing new items in the shop, Uncle Ben turned to Daniel and asked, "Why did you start taking things from the shop?" Daniel paused, thinking hard. "I think it was because I felt lonely and upset," he said. "I saw other kids buying sweets, and it didn't feel fair that we couldn't." Uncle Ben nodded thoughtfully. "And how do you feel now? Are you still lonely and upset?" Daniel smiled and shook his head. "Not anymore. Now, when I want something, I talk to my parents about it, and they actually listen to me. Even dinner time felt different now. Instead of throwing out empty food containers, the house smelled of fresh cooking in the evenings." Mrs. Johnson began teaching Queeneth how to make jollof rice, showing her step by step. While the rice cooked, Mr. Johnson helped Daniel with his homework at the table. Sometimes they forgot about the food because they were too busy talking and laughing. This often led to the rice getting a little burnt, but nobody minded. They were enjoying being together. One evening, Mr. Johnson came home and found his family dancing in the kitchen while cooking soup. He put down his laptop bag and joined them, moving in a funny way that made everyone laugh. "Dad, your dancing is terrible," Daniel said, laughing so hard his stomach hurt. "Oh, is it?" Mr. Johnson said with a grin, and danced even worse, making Queeneth laugh so much she had to sit down. As he looked at his happy family, Mr. Johnson realized something. All those years of working late, trying to make more money and giving his kids everything, they were the wrong things. His children didn't need more toys or expensive schools. They needed him and their mom. They needed moments like this, laughing. "You played football with me for 2 whole hours, even though you're not very good at it," Daniel added with a teasing grin. "Not good?" difference.